Welcome everyone, my name is Jordan Farmer. This is the Uncommon Ground YouTube channel where we are indoctrinating the masses, and today I'm going to be talking about the differences between economic policy and trade policy and why we should have a very different approach when considering those two different things, particularly with government policy and intervention in those two arenas. Yesterday I did not quite lay out what the ideal trade policy would look like because I felt like I could do sort of a part two to complement the part one that was yesterday. The fundamental difference between thinking of these two worlds is economics is the study of one hypothetical fixed system and the innovation and gains and activities within that one system. Trade is the interaction between two different systems, two different consumer markets, production markets, investment markets, labor pools, and capital pools. So the interactions between these different markets require much more nuanced thinking than just considering straight economic policy. When it comes to straight economic policy, a decentralized or free market consumption, production, investment, labor, and capital market will produce the most innovation and the most gains over time. But when you have trade and you have the interaction between systems, what you wind up with is the potential for the innovation to be unequal and the gains to be unequal and separated. The innovation and the gains don't necessarily have to be tied together because you have this interaction. And the interactions between systems can be manipulated to favor one system over the other. There are over 200 or about 200 countries, so 200 individual markets, so to speak, and trade. That means that there's thousands of potential trading relationships that need to be considered and strategically influenced by our leaders and by the United States in order to make sure that all of those are going at least closer to the direction that we want them to go. And again, if we sanction a certain country, we can also say if you do business with that country, then we will sanction you as well. But all those different relationships gets down to a very fundamental question. Should we be involved in things like TPP or what's called multilateral trade deals? Or should we be involved in bilateral trade deals, which means one-on-one with countries or one-on-one with different economic bodies like the European Union or certain countries like Saudi Arabia and stuff? They have very tight ties with other countries, so they kind of operate as a unit economically, especially the oil countries, the oil cartel. Anywho, so the distinguishing marker for whether a multilateral trade deal or a bilateral trade deal is more appealing 100% has to do with the economic viability, the diversity of different goods and services made in your country, and the size of your country. If you're a tiny country without a lot of economic diversity, you're going to be in a position where if you want to have the full breadth of different types of goods and services and you want to have the best quality, you're going to want to open up your economy quite a bit so that you can get all those things. At a bare minimum, you want to at least get your country rich and productive enough so that at some point you can produce lots of those things and have a very, very robust internal economy once, you know, all of the right steps have taken place, and once the workers and the capitalists and everything in your country, once they're ready for that. But anyways, no matter what, if you're a small country, you're going to be in a disadvantageous position relative to big countries. So you have two options: bilateral, which can work in your favor if you have powerful friends, or what they generally end up doing is these multilateral trade deals, or just multi-country trade deals. That can allow you, like with the European Union, it can give you this collective authority to be able to negotiate on behalf of the collective, but the individual bodies, just as the states here in the United States or the countries in the European Union, you give up a certain amount of your individual authority economically and your individual flexibility with economic policy when you get involved in those kinds of things. And it's ultimately, those types of deals are just multinational corporations influencing all of this economic activity and trade because they can get around accountability with certain citizens and still make lots of money and still make the deals that they want to make. Big countries like the United States have a lot of weight. We're rich to begin with. We're very economically productive. And we have a large population. We have a large land mass. So we have a lot of strengths economically going for us. We're connected to 2 giant oceans. We're in between, you know, we can connect through those oceans to the entire world. So because we're in such a strength position, we could so choose to take we're going to take care of ourselves most. Tariffs are up, barriers are up, and to the extent you want to buy stuff from us, you can, but we're just going to insulate ourselves from your guys' economic policies as much as we can. Some things we will have to buy from other countries. What those are, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm sure there's certain raw materials and things like that that we will need. And you do have, to some extent, relationships you have to consider with all this stuff. But anyways, to my conservative friends who will say that trade deficits and trade deficits don't really impact the economy very much. They're ultimately what's best for the system to operate as efficiently as possible. All that, A, assumes the one fixed system, but B, it ignores their most cherished economic metric, which is GDP, which, real quick, GDP, gross domestic product, it basically means how productive our country is. How much money do we make as a country? What they don't mention is that calculated within GDP, you have like government investment, government consumption, private sector investment, private sector consumption, plus plus the balance of exports and imports. So what that basically means is when you make stuff in a country, say you make $100,000 worth of stuff, but then you spend $20,000 getting stuff that you could have made yourself from someone else, you end up with $80,000 in terms of the money that you have made, or your net productive. Like if you had to get 20 grand worth of stuff to produce that 100,000, then you're actually only making 80,000 as a country. Whereas if you made all of the things yourself 100%, then you still have the 100,000. So exports and imports and the balance of trade is directly tied to GDP, which means trade deficits are like a suppressive or a oppressive force, or I'm trying to think of the term, but it's a suppressive force on our economy. It pushes our economy down, it deflates our economy, whereas it subsidizes and inflates the economies of countries we're having trade surpluses with. And we mask a lot of bad policy for other countries through our trade deficit, which is something like $800 billion a year, which, just to understand, that's about, at our peak GDP in the recent years, that is equivalent to about 4% of GDP. So that's 4% of GDP we could be gaining every single year instead of losing if we had these renegotiated deals. So the way it can work is you have the cost of this, the cost of trade period, is that certain industries that will exist in your country will go to other countries in order to kickstart this whole process. But once the money goes over there, then between the profit or the labor value and the productivity that's being initiated within that country, their consumer market will grow and their investment market will grow. And the hypothetical sort of game that conservatives talk about is that it then will feed back into your economy because they can then buy stuff from you, and then it creates this dynamic system. You can negotiate the terms of the trade so that that capital flow and flow of goods and services is even, which means it has a neutral effect on GDP, so the productivity of our economy and our policies actually are showing up directly in the growth of our economy. Whereas right now, a lot of the gains in the American system are being siphoned off into other countries, mainly because they have low labor inputs. So the majority of that value, through their inflated currencies, the majority of that value actually goes to the capitalists. It maximizes return on investment, screws us over, and strengthens our enemies at the same time. Anywho, so the ideal trade policy is one where we have even exports and imports with countries, so that we're in a position where we can, because we're richer than most of them, we can choose to tariff them if they behave poorly, and we won't be in that crazy of a position. But also, our economy is not at all being influenced by their policies up or down. The capital flow and the essential GDP of our economy is rock solid. So, said differently, I want reciprocal trade deals. Sound familiar? And when it comes to sanctioning countries, China, Iran, North Korea, some others, and many people won't bring this up, but Saudi Arabia, for what they did to the journalist Khashoggi, and just for their what they've done in Yemen, aided by us. But we're not going to sanction ourselves. It's just not the way it works, unfortunately. But yeah, Saudi Arabia and the oil cartel, I would be all 100% in favor of sanctioning them. And honestly, I'd kind of like to sanction them anyways, because they can make oil much cheaper than they can make oil for a much cheaper price than they actually sell to us. So they make a lot of profit off of us. And if we tariff them, they could use those profits to pay for the tariffs to maintain the access to our markets. And that would be a good source of tax revenue from that part of the world. To just limit how much we strengthen their economies and prop up their artificial systems, but more than anything to give them some pain, make them feel some pain for their human rights abuses. So the next little bit I'm going to talk about is tariffs. Tariffs are a very not well understood type of tax. So they are a singular tax. So if you think about all the countries in the world, imagine you have a line between every single country to every other country. A tariff is a tax on one of those lines going in one direction, which just means, like, say we tariff China, we can still actually trade with all the other countries around them, Vietnam and stuff. And by taxing them and making that relationship more expensive, we actually have directed a lot of investment globally into those other Asian countries. And that is one way to help, like, not only hurt our enemies, but strengthen our allies. But anyway, so a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So it's a tax on foreign production, or it's a tax on foreign profit, and foreign labor, depending on how you want to conceive of it. But one of the biggest things that was a lie about tariffs, and that was predicted when Trump started talking about implementing tariffs, was that it would result in being ultimately a consumption tax, raise the price of goods and services for consumers, raise the prices of goods and services for the American consumer, and that we would ultimately be worse off economically as a result. But that didn't show up. The massive price increases didn't show up anywhere, and that's for a variety of reasons. One, first off, tariffs can be used to make it so that so to illustrate why or how the prices don't go up, or what's going on here, and why tariffs can be used to actually help grow the domestic economy, but they don't actually result in significant increases in prices. The way this works is, say you have a t-shirt that's made for $5 in China and $6 here in the US, and $5 with shipping and everything in China. if you put a tariff on that Chinese t-shirt of 25%, that would make it cost $6.25 in order to, in this example, t-shirts are being sold for $10 and they could be produced for $6 or $5 depending on the country. China, $5, 25% tariff, it goes up to $6.25. So with a gap of 25 cents per t-shirt, the profit is actually in American production and feeding American production. The profit is hurt a little bit. It's now $3.75 instead of $5. So profit is hurt a little bit, but you now have a certain amount of labor value being re-entered into the economy. And that will create additional consumption dollars, additional investment dollars, and it recirculates the gains of the system back into the economy. So in that example, the tariff makes it so that the production is actually more worth it in the second country. But let's use a different example where the t-shirt in China is actually $4. The t-shirt in the United States is still $6. If you implement a 25% tariff, you'll go up to $5 for the Chinese t-shirt. So it's still cheap. So it's not affecting anything. It's not even coming close to affecting the price yet. And the market, again, for the prices in the American country, in the American consumer market, the price is what it is. And it's only going to be influenced if it has to be pushed up because the entire industry is now has a greater, cost of cotton or whatever it may be. Anywho, in that scenario, you have 25% tax coming out of the profit of the country in China, or coming out of the profit of the business in China or the business in the United States, but it's not affecting prices at all. It's not showing up to the consumer. And in that one scenario, we're getting the tax revenue from the tariff instead of the jobs. And that's the fundamental trade-off between when you choose to tariff in that in-between part as opposed to going over that threshold to make it so that production is actually most viable in the domestic economy, or at least a different economy than the one that it's currently being imported from. The reason why, on the other hand, why we would be fine with at least having American production produce everything for American consumers, it would make things more expensive, but it would not make them so much more expensive that it would not be worth the additional jobs and the additional bits of the economy. It would make it so that people's current wages and stuff would be pushed up, but also wouldn't go quite as far. But it balances out ultimately, and I'll explain why. The reason why the bigger labor inputs from the richer labor country compared to the poorer labor country don't actually equate to a disproportionate or even a proportionate increase in the price is the exact same reason why raising the minimum wage does not disproportionately negatively affect, it does not disproportionately increase prices relative to the increase in people's labor and how much money they're making per hour. And I'll explain this right now. So say you're making a bag of chips, right? And it's $1. And 50 cents of the dollar is labor value and money that's going to labor. If you increase that labor input, so wages or the money that people are making through labor, increase it by 25 cents, so they're making 75 cents per bag as opposed to $1 per bag. Then you increase the cost of one bag of chips by that 25%. The bag of chips has now gone up by 25% in terms of price, but the labor inputs involved in that particular industry and the consumption power of the laborers involved in that industry has gone up 50%. And Ben Shapiro used this particular example, which when I first heard it, it immediately clicked why it was wrong. He said, say you have a barista who's selling muffins. The barista is making $15 an hour and you bump her up to $17 an hour. He said you then would have to increase prices on the muffins to $2 more. Say it was $3 before, now it's $5. Well, that's not actually the way it would work. So it's $17 over the course of an hour, or an extra $2 over the course of an hour. If she sells on average 1 muffin every 15 minutes or 4 in an hour, then it would be 50 cents more for each muffin. So it would go from $3 to $3.50. But she, in that 1 hour, will have made more. So relative to her income, the muffin increase in price is she's getting a greater gain from that increase than the cost of the good is, and the increased cost of the good is spread out over several people, and that one labor input can create multiple outputs. So that's part of the reason why you wouldn't have the entire system fall apart once you go from paying people nothing to 1 penny an hour. If increased wages created this, this terrible effect, then once we started paying people anything, the whole system would fall apart. But obviously that's not the way it ends up working. I'm going to do a separate video entirely on a living wage and the minimum wage, and on raising wages. But that gave you at least a little bit of a sneak peek, a sneak peek into how why the minimum wage the anti-minimum wage arguments from conservatives are wrong. I'm still, and this is the interesting part, I'm still against the minimum wage for different reasons, but at the end of the day, that is that particular argument against the minimum wage is bunk in my opinion. So anywho, tariffs are fine. The ideal trade policy is that we have reciprocal trade with all the countries we choose to trade with, but if they're bad actors on the world stage, they misbehave, they are terrorist funders, or whatever the issue may be, if they misbehave, we will use our economic might to punish them and to work with our allies across the world to punish them, to push the world into a less totalitarian, place, a place with greater respect for human rights and human freedom and minimal government intervention into people's lives. All right, that has been the differences between trade and economic policy, as well as what the ideal trade policy might look like. Please like and subscribe, click the notification bell, and please share it. I want to get these ideas out to people so we can level up our political understanding and change the world and change the 21st century.